Well, let's just say that the powers to be they were not too happy that I was doing something like that, and I kind of got backed up against a wall, and I wanted to go out and play, so I decided that I'm going to go out and play. I thought I'd be waving the Van Halen flag.
Okay, stop scrolling for just a second, because what I'm about to tell you is something that most Van Halen fans, even the diehard ones, don't fully know. Michael Anthony, the guy with the Jack Daniels bass, the guy whose voice you heard on every single Van Halen anthem, Panama, Jumped, Running with the Devil. The man was there for all of it. And yet, when the band finally got back together for one of the biggest rock reunions in history, he wasn't invited. No phone call, no sit-down conversation, no, hey, we're moving in a different direction. Just gone, replaced by a teenager. And here's the part nobody talks about enough. Michael Anthony actually told us exactly how it felt, in his own words. And honestly, it's one of the most emotional, complicated stories in all of rock and roll history. So buckle up, because today on Hidden Fame Files, we're going deep. We're going behind the stage lights, behind the backstage smiles, and behind the decades of silence to tell you the full story of Michael Anthony and Eddie Van Halen, the brotherhood, the betrayal, and eventually the closure that came just a little too late. Let's get into it. All right, so to understand everything that happened later, and trust me, it gets messy, you've got to go all the way back to where Michael Anthony started, because this is not a story that begins with fame. It begins with a kid in Southern California who just absolutely loved music. Michael Anthony Sobolewski, yeah, that's his real last name, don't worry, we'd all go by Anthony too, was born in Chicago in 1954, but his family eventually landed in the Los Angeles area, and from pretty early on, it was clear this kid had something. He picked up the bass guitar and took to it like it was second nature. Now, the LA music scene in the early to mid-1970s was a completely different animal than what it is today. You had bands playing every bar, every club, every house party, grinding it out, trying to get noticed. It was loud, it was sweaty, and it was competitive. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos was a young Michael Anthony playing in various local bands, learning his craft, figuring out who he was as a musician. But here's where the story takes that first turn you didn't see coming. Michael Anthony crossed paths with a band called Mammoth, and the two guys leading that band were a pair of Dutch immigrant brothers who went by the names Eddie and Alex Van Halen. Now, Mammoth had a problem. They were renting PA equipment and certain gear from another local band, and at some point, Michael Anthony, who was in that other band, essentially became the solution to their logistical problem. He had gear they needed, and somewhere in those early conversations and jam sessions, it became clear that he was exactly the bass player they needed too. He joined the band, and just like that, the four-piece lineup that would eventually become Van Halen was complete. Think about that for a second. The whole thing started because of gear. If Michael Anthony's band hadn't had the equipment, if he hadn't been in the right place at the right time, Van Halen might never have existed in the form we know it. Wild, right? So Mammoth eventually became Van Halen. They renamed the band, they kept grinding the LA club circuit, and they built a reputation so ferocious that they were practically a legend before they even released a single record. Word spread fast. There was this guitarist named Eddie Van Halen who was doing things on a guitar that no one had ever seen before. People showed up just to watch him play. And Michael Anthony was right there beside him, night after night, holding down the low end with this rock-solid, reliable groove that gave Eddie the freedom to go absolutely nuclear on the fretboard. That's something worth pausing on, actually, because Michael Anthony doesn't always get the credit he deserves for what he brought to this band. People talk about Eddie's guitar work, rightfully so, the man was a genius, and they talk about David Lee Roth's theatrics, Sammy Hagar's voice. But Michael Anthony, he was the glue. He was the guy who made sure the whole machine stayed together. His bass playing wasn't flashy. It wasn't trying to be. It was exactly what that band needed. Steady, melodic, propulsive, the kind of bass playing where you might not notice it consciously, but the second it was gone, you'd feel the absence immediately. And then there were his vocals. Oh man, those backing vocals. If you've ever been at a Van Halen concert, or even just played their records loud in your car on a highway with the windows down, you know what I'm talking about. That high, soaring, almost angelic backup vocal that stacked perfectly on top of whoever was singing lead. That was Michael Anthony, every time. The harmonies on Ain't Talking About Love, the huge choruses on Why Can't This Be Love, the sing-along moments on basically every Van Halen anthem ever recorded. Michael Anthony was the secret ingredient that made those songs feel bigger than life. And the fans knew it, even if the industry sometimes forgot. Van Halen's debut album dropped in 1978, and it was nothing short of a seismic event. Rock music shifted on its axis. Guitar players all over the world heard Eruption and had the same basic reaction, which was, wait, you can do that? And the band rode that momentum hard, album after album, tour after tour. By the early 1980s, Van Halen was one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. Now here's what I want you to picture. You're Michael Anthony in 1983. You've been with these guys for a decade. You've toured the world. You've recorded all these records. You're a founding member of one of the most famous bands in rock history. You're living the dream. And then comes the 1984 tour. And this is where things start to get dark. According to the band's former manager, Noel Monk, who wrote a book about his time with Van Halen called Runnin' with the Devil, during the period surrounding the 1984 album and tour, Michael Anthony was essentially pressured into signing away his songwriting credits and a significant portion of his royalties. Just think about that for a moment. Here's a guy who has been there since day one, who was on those records, who contributed to the sound, the vibe, the atmosphere of everything Van Halen created. And reportedly, through a combination of pressure and circumstances, he ends up signing documents that effectively stripped him of his status as a full creative partner. He went from founding member to, essentially, a very well-paid hired hand. Now, and I want to be careful here, Michael Anthony has never been someone who runs to the press screaming about this stuff. He's not that guy. He's always carried himself with a kind of quiet dignity that honestly makes you respect him even more. But the accounts from people who were there paint a pretty uncomfortable picture. The power dynamics inside Van Halen had shifted, and Michael Anthony felt it. This is actually something I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments. Did you know about this side of the story? Because I feel like this part gets overlooked constantly in favor of the flashier drama involving David Lee Roth. Drop your thoughts down below. Now, fast forward a bit. David Lee Roth left in 1985. Sammy Hagar came in, and honestly, for a while, things were great. The band had massive success in the Hagar era. 5150, OU812, for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. These were huge records, and Michael Anthony was right there, solid as ever, adding those harmonies, keeping that rhythm section locked in tight. By a lot of accounts, the Hagar era actually had a better internal dynamic than people give it credit for. Michael and Sammy clicked. They were friends, genuinely. You could see it in the way they moved on stage together, the way they talked about the band in interviews. But behind the scenes, things with Eddie became complicated. Eddie Van Halen was a genius, nobody disputes that. But genius and stability don't always travel together. There were struggles, personal ones, health ones, and as the years went on, the tension inside the band grew. By 2004, when Van Halen did a reunion tour with Sammy Hagar, Michael Anthony was reportedly forced to take a pay cut, not just a slight adjustment, but a meaningful reduction in what he was owed. And on top of that, he had to sign away his rights to the Van Halen name and logo just to participate. Read that again. He had to give up rights to a band he helped create just to be allowed back on stage with them. I don't know about you, but that one hits hard. And then came the moment that really broke things, the public stuff. At some point in the mid-2000s, Eddie Van Halen started giving interviews where Michael Anthony was, let's say, not spoken about kindly. There were comments on his musicianship, comments that minimized his contributions, public statements that felt, to anyone who knew the history, unnecessarily cruel. Michael Anthony, for the most part, stayed quiet. He took it. He didn't fire back in the press. He didn't do the tabloid circuit bashing Eddie. He just kind of absorbed it and kept going. That actually tells you a lot about who Michael Anthony is as a person. But here's the thing that really drove the final nail. 2006, Van Halen announced a reunion tour with David Lee Roth. And Michael Anthony? He found out through the media, like a fan. Not through a phone call from Eddie, not through a meeting, through the news. He was out. And Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's teenage son, was in. Now look, I'm not here to tear Wolfgang apart. The kid is legitimately talented, and we'll come back to that part of the story. But from Michael Anthony's perspective, imagine being a founding member of a legendary band with decades of history on those stages and finding out you've been replaced by your bandmate's son through a press release. That's not just professional, that's personal. That's a message. And Michael Anthony understood what that message was. So what do you do when the band you helped build kicks you out? You keep playing music, because that's who you are. Michael Anthony didn't disappear. He didn't go sit on a beach somewhere feeling sorry for himself. Okay, maybe there was a little beach time. The man lives in California, we can't blame him. But professionally, he stayed busy. He and Sammy Hagar stayed close. They formed Planet Us. Then they joined forces with guitar legend Joe Satriani and drummer Chad Smith to form Chickenfoot, which was an absolute blast of a band. No pretension, just 4 ridiculously talented guys having fun and rocking hard. And then came the circle: Hagar, Anthony, guitarist Vic Johnson, and Jason Bonham. They've been playing together for years now, and they've gotten increasingly tight and powerful as a live act. The thing about this period of Michael Anthony's life that people don't talk about enough, he seemed happier, genuinely, like the weight of whatever was going on inside Van Halen had been lifted. He could smile on stage and mean it. Hey, before we go any further, if you're finding this story as fascinating as I think you are, do me a favor and smash that like button and hit subscribe right now. Hidden Fame Files is built for exactly this kind of deep dive. And if you want more stories like this one, that button is how you make sure we keep them coming. This stuff takes real work to dig up, and your support means everything to keeping this going. Now, October 2020, the day the rock world stopped. Eddie Van Halen passed away. Lung cancer. He was 65 years old. And whatever complicated feelings Michael Anthony had, whatever unresolved tension, whatever wounds were still open, suddenly became something else entirely. Because now there was no chance for a real conversation. No possibility of sitting down, face to face, man to man, and working through whatever had happened. Michael Anthony has spoken about this in interviews, and it's genuinely heartbreaking. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he and Eddie never had the chance to really settle their differences before Eddie died. Imagine carrying that. You spent decades of your life alongside someone. You made music together that literally millions of people have in the soundtrack of their lives. You went through everything together, the highs, the chaos, the drama, and then they're gone, and the conversation never happened. That's a specific kind of grief, a specific kind of weight. Okay, quick pause here. If you're getting a lot of value from this video and you want to see more stories like this one, go ahead and hit that hype button. YouTube's newer hype feature is a great way to tell the algorithm you want more content like this, and it genuinely helps channels like Hidden Fame Files bring you these kinds of deep dives. If this story is hitting home for you, the hype button is right there. Use it. But here's the part of this story that actually gave me chills when I first found out about it. Because amid all the sadness, there was also this, a moment of genuine, unexpected closure. Late 2023, Las Vegas, Wolfgang Van Halen is performing a show with his own band, Mammoth WVH, and Michael Anthony comes to the show. And afterward, backstage, they talk, really talk, for the first time in nearly 20 years. Wolfgang later described that night as something that was long overdue. He said Michael is family. He shared photos of the two of them on social media, and Michael Anthony said something in an interview that stuck with me since I read it. He said that night gave him a lot of closure, that even without Eddie being there, or maybe because of the absence of Eddie, because of who was there instead, something important was resolved. Think about that. The guy who took Michael Anthony's spot in the band, the son of the guy who pushed him out, and yet there they were, two good people who had nothing to do with the decisions that had separated them, finally getting to have an honest moment. Michael Anthony even said he's friends now with the guy who took his job. He said it plainly, without bitterness. That says something about both of them. And let me ask you this. Do you think Van Halen ever could have done a proper tribute tour after Eddie passed, one that included Michael Anthony? Because from what I've read and researched, the answer to that is complicated. Let me know what you think in the comments. Now, in the years since Eddie's passing, there have been serious attempts to organize something, a tribute, a tour, something to honor what Van Halen meant to the world. Alex Van Halen was reportedly involved in discussions, Sammy Hagar was involved, Michael Anthony was interested, and it just didn't come together. Michael Anthony himself has commented on this, saying essentially that it just wasn't meant to be, which is heartbreaking, honestly, because you can imagine what that would have meant to the fans, a proper send-off, a celebration, one more time. But it didn't happen. And in the absence of that, Valerie Bertinelli, Eddie's ex-wife and Wolfgang's mother, and Wolfgang himself have quietly taken on the role of protecting Eddie's legacy. They've been careful about what they endorse, what projects they support, what gets made in Eddie's name. There have been conversations about biopics, about documentaries, about all the ways Hollywood and the entertainment industry want to turn Eddie Van Halen to life into a product. And the family's general position has been, be very careful. Don't let the story get sensationalized. Don't let the music become the backdrop for drama. And honestly, you can't really argue with that instinct. Eddie Van Halen was the kind of musician that happens once in a generation, maybe once ever. And the way you honor it isn't necessarily with a splashy biopic full of dramatic reenactments and licensed hits playing over slow-motion shots. Sometimes the way you honor it is by protecting the integrity of what the person created. And meanwhile, Michael Anthony and Sammy Hagar just keep playing. In 2024, they launched what became known as the Best of All Worlds Tour, with guitarist Joe Satriani joining alongside drummer Kenny Aronoff. They were playing Van Halen music, not pretending to be Van Halen, but honoring it, celebrating it, keeping it alive for the fans who grew up with it. And in early 2025, they took that show to Las Vegas for a residency at Dolby Live, multiple nights, sold out. Michael Anthony, when asked about whether they had gotten any blessing from the remaining Van Halen family, said something that I thought was pretty perfectly stated. He said, "We're not looking for anyone's blessing." And then he followed it up with, "We don't hold any grudge or any ill will to Alex or Dave or anybody. We're just out there trying to serve up what the fans want to hear." Clean, direct, no drama. That is Michael Anthony in a sentence. Now, here's something else that's lurking beneath the surface of all this, and it's wild. Michael Anthony has confirmed that there are unreleased Van Halen recordings, a lot of them. He said there are miles of stuff sitting in boxes at Eddie's 5150 studio. Songs from before the first album, songs from across the whole career, including some things that were reworked for the 2012 reunion album, A Different Truth. But when asked if fans will ever hear any of it, his answer was basically, probably not. Let that sink in. There is unreleased Van Halen material. We will probably never hear it, which is its own kind of heartbreak. And here's where the story takes one more interesting turn, because while Michael Anthony never got to have that conversation with Eddie, never got to clear the air directly, he's found a version of peace anyway. He's talked about how the music itself is the legacy, not the drama, not the business disputes, not the contracts, the music. Panama, Hot for Teacher, Why Can't This Be Love? Dreams, Right Now. Those songs don't belong to anyone's legal agreement. They belong to the people who've loved them for 40 years. They belong to the kid who heard Eruption for the first time and couldn't believe what he was hearing. They belong to the parent who plays Jump in the car and watches their kids sing along without even knowing they're singing Van Halen. Michael Anthony played on those records. He sang those harmonies. He was there. No contract can take that away, and no amount of drama can erase what he contributed to some of the best rock music ever made. Here's where I want to leave you with one final thought, and then one final question. There's a version of this story where Michael Anthony is the tragic figure, pushed out, underpaid, disrespected, replaced. And yeah, a lot of that happened, and it's worth being honest about. But there's another version, and I think it's actually the more accurate one. Michael Anthony is a guy who loved music so much that no amount of behind-the-scenes ugliness could kill that love. He was the backbone of one of the greatest bands in rock history. He kept going after he was pushed out. He built new things. He stayed true to himself. He didn't trash people publicly. He didn't burn bridges he didn't have to burn. And when the moment came, in a Vegas venue, backstage after a concert, face to face with Eddie Van Halen's son, he was willing to be open, willing to let the grief and the history and the old wounds take a back seat to something more important: connection. That's not a tragic story. That's actually kind of a beautiful one. And I think if Eddie Van Halen could have seen that night, Michael and Wolfgang hugging it out backstage in Las Vegas, some part of him would have been glad. Last question before we wrap up, and I genuinely want to hear what you think on this one. If Van Halen does a tribute show someday with Michael Anthony, Sammy Hagar, David Lee Roth, whoever is willing and able, would you go? Would that feel like a celebration, or would it feel like it was missing the point? Because I go back and forth on that one. Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. All right, that's it for today's episode of Hidden Fame Files. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, first of all, thank you. That genuinely means a lot. We put real time and real care into every story we tell here. If this video hit home for you, you already know what to do. Like, subscribe, and share this with a Van Halen fan in your life. And if you haven't already, smash that hype button. It's a small thing that makes a huge difference for this channel and helps us keep bringing you stories like this one. The story of Michael Anthony isn't really about Van Halen drama. It's about what it means to dedicate your life to something and what happens when the people you built it with don't see you the way you see yourself. It's about dignity, about resilience, and about finding peace in your own time, your own way. Michael Anthony found his peace, and we're all lucky he kept playing along the way. I'll see you in the next one.